Hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about animals that have been modified. We're not modified necessarily with CRISPR, but with other manipulations. So, of course, if we're talking about genetically modified animals, then we are talking about organisms that have in the germline. So usually we're talking about manipulating fertilized eggs or sperm prior to zygote formation. You might even manipulate the early embryo. There's been examples where the early embryos were hit with raising them to modify, and all sorts of other techniques that you can read up on elsewhere. Modification of animals has been almost exclusively commercialized for research means, so that means that the technology is almost only used in the research field. There are very few organisms, animal organisms, that you can purchase for yourself. One of those options is the glowfish. So if you've ever gone to a place like even going to Petland in Winnipeg, you can find these fish for sale. These are GLO fish. They have been modified with fluorescent genes from sea jellies, and I believe these were done with that transgenic method, with the bacterial infection method that we discussed in the previous video. And so here we see the insertion of those fluorescent genes. Essentially, these genes code for proteins that can create fluorescent compounds, and those fluorescent compounds will then become present in the skin cells of the organism. You simply put them on a chromosome that codes for skin cells, and the organism becomes colored in this way. They look especially bright under black lights. We also see things like fruit flies are used in many different experiments, and they've been modifying fruit flies for years, at least since the 50s and longer, modifying those fruit flies and exposing them to various different methods for modification, and then exploring what's changed in their genome, what changed in their chromosomes, what do they look like now, and what sort of traits they gain or lose. The only current available organism that you can find that is for sale for food is the Aqua Advantage salmon. This is a transgenic Atlantic salmon. It carries the growth hormone regulating gene of a Pacific Chinook salmon and a promoter sequence for an ocean pout. So it has two different fish that have been combined. Two different fish genes have been combined together in the lab, then incorporated into the Atlantic salmon genome. The growth rate for these fish is now 16 to 18 months instead of 3 years. And when they studied the proteins that are being produced in their meat, they're noticing no difference in the fish allergies of these new salmon. They are grown in captivity, and they are grown as females. They're able to control the sex of the fish by regulating, I believe, the temperature of the eggs. I could be wrong on that, but they're able to externally regulate the whether it's a female or male egg. It might also be possibly when they are modifying them. I believe they modify. That's what it was. They modify the sperm, and when they're modifying the sperm, they can just select for the sperm that have sort of the equivalent of the XX genes versus XY. So they just remove any sperm that have Y chromosomes and only fertilize with X chromosome sperm, essentially. So they have only female salmon, and so that way that if the salmon were to escape into the wild, it would not be able to spread its gene, because not only is it a female, it is also a female that cannot reproduce. The farmers are also supplied with living fish, not with eggs, so that they raise the fish from the fish state, and they can't make their own eggs. This falls into a dicey area of genetic modification and genetic engineering, is that often the company owns a lot of the rights to the organism. So in this case, the farmers are not going to be supplied with eggs, so they lose the ability to raise their own eggs. And and they're dependent on this company to provide them with those fish. But one of the things to think about, a benefit here, right, is that we are of now we don't need to apply hormones to cause growth. The organism now naturally produces the hormones it needs for growth. If you think about applying drugs to an organism, remember that you're always going to have to apply way more drug if you're applying it externally to get the effect as opposed to producing it naturally. So in this case, if you were thinking about growing some salmon and you wanted to compete with this Aqua Advantage salmon, you might have to apply a growth hormone, and that growth hormone is going to be applied in a very high dosage so that some of that growth hormone will end up in the salmon and will end up causing the effect that you want. That excess hormone is going into your water supply. If it's not carefully treated, it will end up in the environment around, and it can cause all sorts of damage to the other organisms in the local area. And certainly, this is the case in the runoff from farms where hormones are used to raise cattle and pigs faster than normal. So instead, we've caused a genetic change. This genetic change will not have impact on the environment around it, provided we follow the preventative measures that they've taken, such as supplying only with fish and supplying with only with infertile females. So in that way, those fish are not able to spread to the environment around them, so they have very little impact. They have less impact than the natural variety. And you can produce them faster, so you could feed more people fish, which is a fairly energy efficient organism to feed the world. Oncomice are another. The oncomouse is one of the first patented organisms. They were patented by Harvard University in 1988. They are essential to medical technology. These are mice that have that can be raised and genetically modified to get specific genetic traits, which are typically genetic disease traits. I've heard of things like ordering a mouse that in 2 weeks will become diabetic, so that to that kind of control where they can say, hey, you're interested in studying diabetes, especially early onset diabetes. Okay, great. Here's a mouse that you can use as a model. You can apply your drug over these 2 weeks and see if it will or will not develop diabetes, and or if you want it to have lung cancer, you want it to have a heart attack. You can order these mice. We have such control over the genetics of this mouse that you can order it with very, very specific diseases and know that it'll be a dependable model that you can apply for. Now, animal models are not perfect. They're not the best way to study disease, but they are a good starting point. And having that much control is something we simply are never going to have when we go to study humans. Genetically engineered plants. We certainly have lots of genetically engineered plants. There was a tomato in 1994 that was put on the shelf. It was changed so that it did not rot as quickly, and so that was in 1994. It was modified. It was genetically engineered with I believe it was bombardment. I think it was. I think they used DNA bombardment. I can't be exactly. I can't remember exactly. But essentially, they imported a anti-rotting gene related tomato plant, and now those tomatoes will last much, much longer on the shelf. There's lots of examples where they're targeting shelf life and flavor and resistance to pests, resistance to pesticides and fungicides, and nutritional value. But still, I believe the number is still very low. I think it's only 20 or so crops that you can actually buy that qualify as genetically engineered. This is one of the places where proponents that are for where people who are against the GMO labeling system or the GMO-free label. They will argue, why are we labeling things GMO-free when 99% of the foods on the shelf are GMO-free? There are only these handful of crops out there. We can just label those instead. These are GE foods instead. And you don't have to go out there and buy GMO-free salt, for example. That's ridiculous. Salt is not made from an organic source, so you don't have to worry about it being modified. Okay, some that are coming out possibly one day, maybe. One example is scorpion cabbage, as it's kind of called on the internet. It's the shorthand name. It's obviously not what they'll end up naming this plant, but it is a type of cabbage that has actually had a gene from a scorpion venom gene spliced out and put into its genome. This gene is only toxic to caterpillars, and it's not toxic to humans. And so now this cabbage can defend itself against against caterpillars, and you can reduces pesticides. And that's really important. The runoff of pesticides and its effects on the environment is a huge impact on our environment. And having farmers have to spray their fields with an excess of pesticides to remove things like caterpillars is going to have large impacts on the environment around it. If you can give this cabbage a protein that human beings are fine to eat, they're not allergic to it, they're not even affected by it in any way, but this one little protein becomes toxic to this other animal. Caterpillars are not even in our same phylum, so those caterpillars, you can reduce that need for that pesticide. And there are, as we discussed in our evolution unit, increasing use of pesticides simply creates a natural selection pressure that increases the selection towards organisms that are resistant to pesticides, and that's no good either. Another example is golden rice. This was a type of rice that was developed to contain more vitamin A and carotene using additional genes from the daffodil and a soil bacteria that produces those products. So they took these two. They are producing the exact same product that we already need in our bodies and get from other foods: vitamin A, carotene, things that we already eat and get from everywhere. Even if the genes are from a bacteria and from a daffodil, the product of those genes is still a protein, and that protein is still producing vitamin A and carotene. The idea was to incorporate this gene into the rice. It caused the rice to look a little bit yellowed in color, so they ended up naming it golden rice. And it was developed for countries where there is a high rate of childhood blindness because of a vitamin A deficiency. So this vitamin A deficiency can lead to blindness. Leads to blindness in children. And so by doing this change, I believe the increases I remember reading were something like 15% or more increase in the amount of vitamin A in their diets. And they have successfully had a couple of countries sign on for this. Unfortunately, the genetically engineered organism out into the market is very, very expensive. There are a lot of logistics, a lot of legalities to go through. You need farmers who are going to grow it. You need to get it approved by various FDA groups and things like that. And the testing has to be very extensive, and many, many years of testing to make sure that it doesn't have deficiencies. So typically they're looking at hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe billions of dollars invested into a product before you even know if people are going to buy it. And with the case of golden rice, it tastes very much like regular rice, and so they really were only doing it for this one one solution to solve a problem in vitamin A deficiency, which is not a problem in some of the other in other countries where vitamin A you're able to get vitamin A from other sources like different types of foods. So in those countries, they're probably not going to pay the extra money to have a golden rice, and or in those countries where where different food types is available or food is plentiful. I guess this should be actually developing countries. So developed countries, or high income countries, those countries are typically going to get the food from get vitamin A from other resources. So they're not going to pay the extra money for the golden rice. So the product might not be profitable, and they have to invest all this money ahead of time. So some ethical considerations I would like you to think about is that genetic modification may have an unforeseen consequence in the future, right? So example, strains of insect-resistant corn may reproduce in the wild, and then that could cause a change in the genetic diversity, and we don't know what could happen. They do a lot of work to prevent this from happening, so we are being very careful, and I trust in science and scientists to be very careful with the production of the genetic modified organisms. But there is a fair argument in saying that we don't know what the impact could be entirely of these genetic modified organisms if they got out in the wild. If GMOs were released in the natural world, they may be uncontrollable and then also replace the current organism. And there's a secondary example here that we should consider is that if they replace or outcompete, as we talk about in the context of evolution, outcompete current wild type, genetic diversity would be reduced. So if this GMO is a very efficient in the current conditions, it might be very, very successful, but then after being very, very successful, it will be the only genome that will be kicking around, and that would be bad because now we have a low genetic diversity. Low genetic diversity means you're more prone to extinction. So initially, this could be a very successful organism. These seeds land in some field somewhere. They become wild corn seeds. The wild corn spreads everywhere, and then time goes by, and now suddenly you look back and you see that all the corn has this GMO, this genetically modified genome, and they don't have the natural genome anymore. And suddenly the environment shifts, and all those plants are affected in a different way, and maybe they go extinct, and then we would be in a bad place. Some ethical considerations that supporters will choose is that GMOs could be developed for surviving harsh environmental conditions and to avoid starvation, especially as the global temperature changes, as food resources might become scarce in the future. We need some technology that will be able to feed the rest of the world. So with rising global populations, new technology is going to be needed. Also, pest-resistant seeds have been donated to countries too poor to afford pesticides, and that's been a really excellent way of raising GMO crops in a place where you can't get access to pesticides. Give them these GMO crops, and those GMO crops could feed a village or feed a population, and they wouldn't have to have access to extra things like sprayers and the crop dusters and stuff like that. Now, there is also something to be said about the patenting of these transgenic organisms. These they have to be built from the DNA from other species, in addition to being built from unique DNA sequences. These unique sequences cost millions of dollars just to produce, plus the 5 to 10 years of scientific testing, which have all sorts of costs associated with it. There's thousands of people involved in this process. And plus farmers and things like that, and distribution and collaboration around the world. So they will typically file for a patent for these DNA sequences to make sure that they can recoup those costs. We do live in a capitalist society. These are not being made just for the good of scientific development, except for maybe the golden rice, which hasn't been able to move farther than that because it's not being made for profit. And so because of these investment costs, the patented organisms are often priced much higher than the natural species. And that could be but there is a danger that if a GMO is too good, it could also outcompete. So then it could create a monopoly. And that's one of the cases against something like canola, where where canola is kind of the only option. There's only canola grows as canola. And so you have to buy your canola from canola distributors and who own the rights to the seed because it's a genetically modified organism. All right, hopefully that's an overview of a whole bunch of different ideas. I really want you to think about CRISPR. I think it's very cool, and I think it fits very well with some of the stuff that we've already discussed. Please take some consideration for the things I said about GMOs that we currently use and the considerations for those, and we'll discuss more in the future. Actually, probably not. This is probably the last time we'll talk about GMOs for a little while until you finish up this course. All right, have a great day.